Hi, I'm Rachel from 7 and All, and today I want to talk to you about how to teach history well. Let's just sit down and let's have a conversation about teaching history in our homeschools. Because history can be hard, and hard things are worth thinking about. They're worth doing well. Now, in this video, I am not going to be giving you the one perfect history resource that answers all of your needs. I'm really just going to be having a conversation with you and bringing up some deep things that we need to think about if we're interested in doing a very good job of teaching history with our children, of not simply whitewashing history, turning it into a sparkly fairy tale castle full of perfect heroes and evil villains where good always wins, and where we can learn honesty from George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and refusing to lie about it. If that's not what we want, it's worth thinking about how do you do it in a way that is not that's actually going to communicate truth about history and leave our kids very well versed in history as they go out into adulthood. So let's begin with one. Start very at the basic level. One, ask yourself, why are you teaching history in your homeschool? And for most of us, the answer is going to be entirely obvious. It is for practical reasons. History is a required subject for pretty much all of education. You gotta learn history. You can't just skip it. So regardless of how you feel about history, whether you feel it's super boring or super fun, it's required, you gotta do it. So we're starting from a practical baseline. However, most of our children are not going to grow up to become history professors or professional historians. History isn't so much like math or language skills that you can really see how it's going to be used in specific professional careers. History is definitely a different sort of subject than math or English, but it still has a lot of value. So you need to think about, and maybe even take time right now to write it down or leave me a comment. Why do you teach history in your homeschool? What do you want your kids to get out of it? And I'm just going to give you one maybe big overarching reason that could guide our teaching of history in our homeschools, and that is so that our kids will have a greater understanding of how humanity got to where we are today, to help them know more of the story. Because if we're just living here in 2021, we're not going to understand how we made it to this place unless we start with the story of all the things that came before. Many of modern day's problems and the good things about modern life, they all have their roots in history, in things that happened long, long before we ever lived. One further reason to teach history very well is that we can't learn from the foolishness and the evil of the past if we don't take time to wrestle with it and to discuss it. If we kind of just ignore it and say, well, that's in the past, we lose the learning value from all of that. So now that we've talked just a little bit about what is our reason for studying history in the first place, I just want to bring forth a couple of principles or a couple of questions to guide you and your thoughts as you think about teaching history well for your homeschool. I mentioned right at the beginning that in teaching history well, we want to avoid a shiny fairy tale version of history where we kind of delete all the ugly and embarrassing things about, important people. And why? Because one of the big arguments for actually doing that, for kind of, simplifying history, getting rid of the ugliness just a little bit, maybe not everything, but there's a lot of ugliness, so let's cut out some of it. One of the big reasons for that is kids are little. They're little, they're sensitive, they have so much hope and excitement for life. I don't really want to expose my kids to so much ugliness of history too soon. So sometimes the idea can become, well, when they're little, we'll do this kind of, nice, happy history where we learn about the good things people do. and later on we can tackle the tough stuff. And I want to suggest an alternative, which my alternative is that if you feel that your kids aren't really ready to talk about at least some hard things in history, I would suggest waiting on history. I don't actually think that there's a reason we need to be doing actual history in kindergarten. You can be doing other things. You can do kind of social studies, community studies, geography, science. Like, there's plenty of things you can be studying with very young children. You don't have to dive into history, because I actually feel that starting with watered down history and then later on when kids are bigger just hitting them with the hard stuff can actually be doing your kids a disservice, because they feel a little bit lied to. They feel like, wait, why did I spend all this time learning that this person was such a good guy and I should aspire to be like this person? And then I learned later on that he was not, like, he didn't really have very great moral values in his personal life and all this drama. That's hard. I think that that's actually harder for kids to deal with, kind of the back and forth from let's do fairy tale history and now later on we'll do real history. So I would actually recommend, until you feel ready and until you know that your kids are ready to start with some history and some conversations about the ugliness of it, just wait. And I suggest that because if you really think about it, history is basically one tragedy after another. It's a genocide, followed by an assassination, followed by a terrible natural disaster, and then a plague. Like, the greatest joys of life, sitting around watching your children play, hugging your grandma and grandpa, those things are not written about in history books. That's not what history is made of. And so if we're not ready to talk about really heavy stuff with our kids, or we know they're not ready, let's just not do it rather than invent a fairy tale history. Next concept. Once you know you and your kids are ready to talk about history, make sure that very early on you teach your kids the process of how we got history. When we're talking about the history of days long past, nobody who is here now was alive to see those events when they happened. So how did we get the textbooks that we read? How did we get Story of the World, or whatever your choice of curriculum is? You can talk to your kids about the process, because I think many kids, if you don't teach them where we got it from, they're not gonna know. They're not just gonna be able to make all these leaps. Talk about primary sources, about letters and newspapers and writings in stone, whatever is accurate to the time period you're studying. Talk about what primary sources are. Show your kids some primary sources, investigate those sources with them, and talk about the work that researchers and historians do to study these sources, cross-reference different people's journals and letters to each other, and talk about how, some of the things even the people at the time were writing down weren't even necessarily true. They were their perspective on an event. So different historians can come to different conclusions after studying the same primary sources. So a lot of times, if you read in two different history books, two slightly different versions of events, it's not necessarily that someone's trying to lie to you, but it could be. It could be, but it could just be that they were coming from different sources. They came to a different conclusion based on their research. But teach your children the process so that they can better understand the textbooks and the curriculum that you are working from. Next big concept I want to highlight. Teach your children to think critically as you read about history, as you learn about history. If critical thinking was taught more commonly, we would have a lot fewer people believing every rumor that they read on the internet. So I'm a big fan in favor of critical thinking skills. I would say don't be afraid to even criticize the textbook that you are reading to your children as you're reading it. I have done that exact thing multiple times. It might be good to go on a search for the perfect textbook that gets it all right. I'm not really 100% sure that exists, but Don't be afraid to use a textbook that might have some flaws, and as you're reading, you can use your critical thinking skills to say, you know what? Hey, I don't think this is actually very accurate. I don't think this is actually a good way of explaining this reason why this war was started or whatever it is. And then you can teach your kids, let's investigate further, and take your kids on a journey of what can you do when you read something and you're not sure if it's true or not. Take your kids on a research journey, and maybe you'll find out, oh, actually what I thought was wrong because I'm finding from multiple sources that this does actually seem to be true. Or maybe you'll find a different source that contradicts, and you can look and see the contrast between those two. So I would actually say teach your kids to not necessarily believe every single thing they read, because books were written by people. Books are not infallible. We can critique them, we can think critically about what we read. We don't, even from the same facts, we don't always have to come to the exact same conclusions. Next big concept. Avoid using history to teach morality to your children. I am 100% not opposed to teaching about morality and good character, but I would argue that history is an extremely poor tool to teach this concept. History is much more accurately a story of immorality after immorality after immorality and all the problems that sin causes. There absolutely are villains and heroes in world history, but even the heroes, even people who did really great things, are not necessarily good people or nice people. And actually, it's important to talk about that. It doesn't diminish somebody, well, in some ways it might diminish it, but we shouldn't be afraid to talk about with our kids about some important person in history who accomplished some great technological innovation, but they were kind of a jerk. We can be able to talk about these things. There were very good inventive people. There were very powerful, creative, genius minds that were not nice to other people. And that can actually start great conversations with our kids. We shouldn't feel a need to say that every person who did great things in history, we're just not going to talk about the bad things they did because we want our kids to look up to them as heroes and, try to strive to do great things themselves. If we are teaching morality, especially for Christians who are trying to teach, good character traits, honesty, and so on, I don't want to teach my kids to be honest because George Washington was honest. I want my kids to be honest because God hates lies. Our morality should not be at all based on the good things that other humans have done in history. Our morality should be based on a desire to live in peace and in relationship with God, to not do the things He hates, to live closely with Him and listen to His Holy Spirit guiding us in our hearts and our minds. Doing right and wrong has nothing to do with the choices people made in the past. We're not really meant to pattern our lives after other humans. We're meant to pattern our lives after Christ. My next big concept, if you want to teach history well, make sure that you get outside of American history, outside of Greek and Roman civilization and European history. And this can be hard because a lot of curriculum that people really love just focuses on these kind of topics. I've seen curriculums that it seems like they spend maybe 8 out of the 12 years solely focused on US history. And the US has, we haven't even been around for 300 years yet. We've only been around a couple hundred years. The world has thousands of years of history. Sure, you can definitely spend extra time on the history of the country where you live, but there's a big world out there, and if we really want to learn about how humanity got to where it is now, we need to be learning about all of history. So look for resources, and you're going to have to look extra hard for resources that focus on some of the not so trendy areas of history in like Southeast Asian history, African history, South American history, different parts of the world that somehow it seems like they just get kind of ignored and skipped and lost. But there's been a lot going on in these other continents too, in these other regions of the world. So don't assume the easiness of the curriculum, because it's easier to buy curriculum for one part of history means that that's the best history that you should study. Sometimes you're gonna have to look a little bit harder. So, and maybe I will do a video at some point. Let me know if you'd be interested on resources that I found for histories that are less trendy and less popular. I shouldn't say trendy. I should not use the word trendy because it's not a trend. It's just consistently popular for generations and generations. These are the histories that are studied. But there's more to history than that, and we can't have a full understanding of world history if we focus only or primarily on Western civilizations and only talk about, Genghis Khan once in a while. That's not enough. Like I started this video by saying, teaching history well is hard. It's not gonna be as easy as opening up a math book and let's learn our addition facts and our subtraction and our multiplication and division. There's not necessarily a set path that's just that easy to follow, building from one skill to another. Because history is the story of people. And like I've always said about homeschool, the hardest thing about homeschool is the human element. It's you and your children. That's what makes it hard. People are what make things hard. History is all about people. So it is gonna be hard. People are complex, but they are also precious. And it is worth it to take the time to look at your history. Look at how you are doing it with your children. Are you teaching them to think critically about what they read? Are you teaching your kids to learn their morality from heroes of the past and kind of covering up some of their mistakes? Or are you talking candidly about, the different kind of choices that even heroes sometimes made some pretty bad choices, or choices that we look back and think, what were you thinking? Why would you think that was a good idea? Are we able to have conversations with our kids in history classes rather than teaching one thing, having them memorize the names and the dates, and then moving on? I hope that this video was encouraging to you and also just challenges you to get your gears going in your own mind about how you can seek to do homeschool history more excellently in your family. I am here to cheer you on and to encourage you in joyful, excellent homeschool. And I hope that if you did like this video, that you would give it a thumbs up. It helps me out a lot. Go ahead and share this video with your homeschool community so that you can start those challenging conversations about homeschool history. And if you're new to this channel, do go ahead and subscribe right down below. All right, I will see you next time. Bye.